As has already been mentioned, I was told that your church hosted a conference this weekend on heaven, and I know that not everybody attended that, but I did want to try this morning to, in some way, loosely connect my sermon to the theme of your conference as maybe, hopefully, an encouraging word on the topic of heaven. Hopefully, even if you weren't at the conference, it will absolutely still connect with you. But it's always a risk trying to incorporate something into another person's teaching material. So my disclaimer here is if I say something that contradicts what he said this weekend, I'm wrong, he's right. Trust him more than me. Heaven, as I'm sure your speaker pointed out, is not a subject Christians spend enough time dwelling upon. And there are many reasons for this, but one of the underappreciated reasons why I think we don't indulge the hope of heaven as we should is there is a nagging suspicion in the recesses of our hearts that at the end of the day, heaven is just too good to be true. This fallen world has forged cynics of us all. The idea of eternal heavenly destiny where everything we long to be true will be true indeed. Again, it just seems too good to be true in many ways. And it's that cynical barrier that we all share between us and heaven's hope that God's word is going to challenge this morning. But I do intend to approach our doubts with the honesty that they deserve. The cynicism, the too good to be true mentality, the can we really indulge this hope as if it is going to happen is completely understandable based upon our experiences in this fallen world. For rarely, if ever, do we find our expectations fully met and certainly not exceeded. Our family visited Disney for spring break recently. Disney World, the most magical place on earth, supposedly. Arguably, I would say, history's greatest attempt to manufacture heaven on earth. In fact, it was conceived out of Walt Disney's dream to create a utopian oasis for all to come and enjoy. He actually believed that through the power of human imagination and ingenuity, that we don't have to look to a transcendent heaven. We can create it for ourselves here on earth. But every parent who has ever done Disney with a family can testify Walt was wrong. It's a good attempt. Maybe the best attempt we've done. I'm not a Disney Scrooge. I love it. I get into it. It's magical, all that stuff. But it's also really hot and really crowded and really expensive and really exhausting. So you put these things together, and this supposed utopian heaven on earth produces some of the greatest child meltdown and parent freakouts on earth. We were in this big crowd trying to get onto a popular ride, and one of my sons accidentally clipped the heel of this man in front of us and caused him to stumble a bit. This grown man turns around and looks at my son and says, "If you touch me again, I'm going to punch you in the face." A grown man said that to a child. I grabbed him by the arm and I said, "Did you just say you were going to punch my son?" And he lied. And he said, no, you misheard me. And his wife, this was so beautiful, his wife staring directly at him, arms crossed, just shaming eyes, didn't look at me and said, "That's exactly what he said." And he apologized, we forgave and parted ways, but it gave me too much pleasure to watch his wife berating him as they walked away. The magic of Disney, right? It's fascinating. It's fascinating to notice the disposition of families in Orlando's airport. Have you ever seen this? Those arriving, just exuding joy, excitement, anticipation, matching Disney shirts, laughter, all this stuff. And then there are the departing flights. With the Disney hangover, just exhausted, disheveled, arguing, barely hanging on, trying desperately to get home intact as one family. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a microcosm. This attempt to produce heaven on earth is a microcosm for life in this world. Disney disappointment is a silly example. admittedly so. But there are far more tragic examples in this room, right? This world that seemingly offers us so much has mistreated you, has harmed you, has broken you, perhaps. Maybe your hopes have been crushed, your dreams remain unrealized. Perhaps you live on the brink of constant frustration and underlying anger. So much loneliness, brokenheartedness, sadness, disappointment, regret, anxiety, depression, guilt, all of this. And of course, this thing called death, the obliterating letdown that waits us all. And even when things do go well, there is this reliable whisper inside of all of us that defiles our happiness with this fatalistic thought. You know this can't last, right? You know the other shoe is going to drop. You know this will all prove too good to be true in the end. And so in this way, life in this world has made cynics of us all. It has forged in us a deep, hardened pessimism. And our response, the only way we know to cope with this existence, is by lowering our expectations of this existence. The gap between expectations and reality, that is the degree, that is the measure of disappointment in our lives. And so what we do is we lower our expectations so as to mitigate the disappointment. And then comes the news of heaven. The promise that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no heart has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. A reality that doesn't just meet our expectations, but exceeds them in infinite ways. We hear that news, and we want to let our hearts go there. We have been trained, though, by our fallen world to be hesitant. Oh, how badly we want it to be true, but we have been discipled in the ways of too good to be true. That cynical barrier to our heavenly indulgence is what I want to address this morning. And I want to do it by taking us to the moment in history where heaven actually did break through on earth. The resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus was the first chapter of heaven's story, the first twinkling of heaven's glory, the first fruit of heaven's harvest. You might think heaven is too good to be true, but because of the resurrection, we know for certain it is not. Let's turn to our passage. I'm going to show you two things this morning. What we are taught to expect and what we ought to expect. Let's look at both of those. What we are taught to expect. So let me briefly set the stage for us since we're just jumping in to the middle of a passage. Jesus Christ, of course, has been crucified and buried, and his disciples are deflated and betrayed. They had given their lives away to Jesus and his claims. They are crushed to discover it was all a lie. But then a crazy rumor begins to spread. Some are claiming that they have encountered Jesus risen from the dead. This is all being reported to the disciples, and you can just imagine, as much as they want to believe it's true, there is just no way they are going to let themselves go there. Too good to be true, right? Not just because of how incredibly unlikely it is they guard their belief, but because they don't want to get their hopes up again, only to be crushed again. That's where our passage picks up. The disciples are in a room together trying to figure out what to make of all these rumors. Verse 36, as they were talking about these things, Jesus stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." Now at this point, they can see Jesus, they can hear Jesus, but they still will not believe it is Jesus. Verse 37, they were startled and frightened and thought that they saw a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." So now they've seen him, they've heard him, they've touched him, but now look at this fascinating verse 41. And listen to this wording. And while they still disbelieved for joy. That is peculiar wording, is it not? Disbelieved for joy. In other words, in the name of joy, they won't let themselves believe this. Jesus is standing right in front of them. They see him, they hear him, they touch him. All the evidential demands have been met, but there is one last obstacle. Perhaps, maybe the most difficult obstacle of all, the fear of too good to be true. The fear of joy. Therefore, they disbelieve to protect their joy. But why? Why are they so scared of joy? Why are we so scared of joy? Why does skepticism always arise in the presence of good news? Well, as I've already said, we've been trained to distrust good news. Forgive me for being cynical, but our cynicism is more than justifiable. I want you to know the Bible would never try to argue with that assessment. The Bible is not a book with its head in the clouds. It is brutally honest with our grief, our sorrows, our pain, our letdowns. Now, it also tells us that it wasn't always this way. When God designed life, life was perfect. Originally, there was no such thing as too good to be true because goodness was the only thing that was true. There was no such thing as high expectations because expectations could not be high enough as originally designed. But of course, we, meaning humanity, messed it all up. You have heard the word sin, of course, before, but perhaps you have only thought of it in terms of morality, offense against God. To sin is to do a bad thing, but sin is much more than that. Sin is a vandalism of God's design, which brought ruin to God's creation. Creation has a creator who designed it a certain way, and sin vandalizes that design. In this way, God's good design is still there, but now it haunts us. It's there as something we know should be true. Echoes of Eden, we call it. But frustratingly, it never comes true as we know it should. You see, life can be good, really good. I'm not saying it can't. But what I am saying is that that goodness is now vandalized goodness. So yes, we experience the goodness of love, but that goodness is marred by hatred in our lives. Of course, we experience the goodness of friendship, but it is marred by betrayal. Yes, the experience of laughter, but it is marred by pain. Yes, the goodness of romance, but that goodness is marred by heartache. And on an ultimate level, yes, we experience the goodness of life, but that goodness is marred by the sting of death. And so how do we cope with this defilement of goodness? How does fallen humanity cope with fallen creation? Again, we lower our expectations. We give up on the dream of Eden in order that we might survive life post-Eden, which is exactly what the disciples are doing in verse 41. They disbelieve for joy. So, what will Jesus do in the face of their disbelief? What does Jesus do with low expectations? He shatters them. We have seen what the world has taught us to expect. Now let's let Jesus show us what we ought to expect. Return to verse 41. While they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" I love that response. He combats their doubts in the most patient and inviting way. Anything to eat? There's a double meaning to that. In one sense, he wants to demonstrate the physical reality of his resurrection. Can a spirit eat a piece of fish? Come on, guys, it's really me. I really am physically risen. But there are many ways he could have proved that he wasn't a spirit. However, he chooses the most hospitable way, a meal. He did the exact same thing when reunited to Peter after the resurrection. The first thing he wants to do with Peter is eat some fish. All this eating after the resurrection, apparently being dead for a couple of days makes one hungry. Or he's trying to tell us a point. And I think it's the latter. A meal is universally understood as the most welcoming and joyful thing we human beings do. Try to think of the biggest and best moments of life, those times you treasure deeply in your memories. I bet it involved the table, food, and the people you cherish. In every culture, a meal together is a sacred space of joy, and it is not a surprise that Jesus chose a meal for us to fellowship until he comes to return. Now, Jesus did life among a fishing culture. Broiled fish would have been on the menu about every meal. So think about how many times Jesus and his disciples sat together eating fish. Think of the memories they shared with Jesus, the laughter, thoughtful conversations, deep intimacy all around a meal of fish. And now standing before them in his resurrection, Jesus calms their fears and combats their doubts with a common act they've seen him do hundreds of times. He eats with them broiled fish as if to say, it's me, guys. It really is me. You can let your hearts go. And that's exactly what happens. The disciples, disbelieving in the name of joy, raise their expectations of hope and invite joy to run wild on their hearts. I didn't read this, but at the end of Luke 24, this is how the gospel ends. This is verse 50. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. Now stop there. This, of course, is what we call the ascension, where the resurrected Jesus is exalted to heaven until he returns again. Now, we just take that event for granted, but could you imagine how disappointing that would have been? Jesus returns from the dead, fullness of promise and joy, the power of the resurrection breaking through this death-filled world. Heaven has come to earth, and then he's gone again. How would you imagine the disciples respond to that? Well, I knew it. Too good to be true, right? We raised our expectation, we got our hopes up, and once again, it all comes crashing down. That's what you would expect. Let me read for you verse 52. And they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Now, it's easy to miss, but very significant. A week earlier, they had entered Jerusalem, riding into Jerusalem with the highest of expectations and joy. The triumphal entry of the Messiah and King into Jerusalem, they thought to establish his kingdom and literally fix the world. And yet in 1 week, their dreams had been crushed. Think of a place where you experience something traumatic. What happens is that space gets desecrated in a sense. Even being around it is eerie, maybe even triggering for you. I grew up in a very volatile house full of childhood trauma. And to this day, if I drive by my childhood home, I just get a pit in my stomach. That's what Jerusalem had become for the disciples. The city where their dreams were crushed, came crashing down, where not just Peter, but all of the disciples denied him and abandoned him, where the one they called Lord was sentenced, condemned, mocked, beaten, crucified. Jerusalem had become the city of shattered expectations. But upon encountering the resurrected Jesus, it said they returned to Jerusalem again with great joy. Just like last week, with great joy, they entered Jerusalem, but this time it was different. This time, their joy is not fragile because it is born out of the resurrection certainty, which made their joy unshakable. Listen, the disciples' lives got harder, not easier. You know this, right? They would all be persecuted. They would all but one die martyr's death, and yet their lives testified to something peculiar, joy. The most strange attribute of the early persecuted church was their joy when it seemed that they had no good reason to be joyful. But the point is they did. They did. They knew Jesus was risen, which meant they knew that hope had finally broken through and overwhelmed hopelessness. They knew that his resurrection was a preview of their future resurrection, indeed the resurrection of the entire cosmos. They knew Easter was just the beginning and that every story would one day likewise have its own Easter. They knew that despite what every miserable circumstance was telling them, the resurrection was truer than their circumstance and one day would undo every circumstance. They knew resurrection was the final word of Christ's story and that Christ has promised it to be the final word of every story, including yours. I want to invite you this morning to vulnerably expose yourself to high expectations. I want to ask you to stop guarding what little joy you have in this world through low expectations and sneering skepticism, and instead raise your expectations and let hope run wild. I want to ask you to stop disbelieving to protect fleeting joy and to actually believe in eternal joy. And I ask you to do that, not as another coping mechanism like think positive, happy thoughts. Think happy thoughts doesn't work. Happy thoughts get crushed too. No, I am asking you to believe that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And he is risen as a preview and guarantee to the destiny of all who trust in him. Heaven came for Jesus, and heaven is coming for you too. And if this morning I can't help, if this morning you are refusing Jesus, my honest, hopefully loving word to you is simple. Keep going with coping methods. Keep your expectations low. Enjoy as much as you can because your cynical heart is actually telling the truth. This actually is as good as it gets apart from Jesus. But it doesn't have to be. You could bury your cynicism in the grave and resurrect eternal hope through giving your life to the resurrected Jesus this day. But for those who trust and follow Jesus, I'm telling you this morning, in the name of Jesus who is risen from the dead, let your hearts go. Indulge in hope. Feast on joy. Dream your dreams of how good life could be, because whatever you dream, your destiny is sure to exceed. I'm not minimizing your circumstances. I know they're real. I'm asking you to courageously look at your circumstances, whatever they may be or whatever you fear they may become. Look at your circumstances, and instead of lowering your expectations to cope with them, look them square in the face and say to them, resurrection is coming for you. My Jesus is risen, and he is coming for you. And soon and very soon he will declare before heaven and earth, the former things have passed away. Behold, I make all things new. Friends, heaven is coming. It really is. As sure as Jesus risen from the dead, heaven is coming for us. Do not lower your expectations to cope with the way things are. Protest the way things are by raising your expectation for what is to come, knowing for certain that no matter how your expectations may be, heaven is sure to exceed them.